Historically, civilizations have collapsed. If anything, that's kind of the routine. And now we're not just a regional civilization. We're not just the Roman Empire. We're not just the Maya. We're a global civilization. And it certainly is possible that whole civilization could collapse. As a global community, we need to think about the kind of world we want to create. If we want something different, because I think if we don't do that, we're going to continue heading down the wrong path.
Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Robert Costanza, one of the leading pioneers in the field of ecological economics. Dr. Costanza has dedicated his career to redefining how to measure economic progress by integrating environmental health, sustainability, and human well-being into economic models. His groundbreaking work on ecosystem services has transformed the way we value nature's contributions to society and challenged the dominance of GDP as a measure of success. Where did this start?
The town that I grew up in, a quite infamous little town in Pennsylvania called Donora.
Donora, Pennsylvania, mysterious death. Residents have difficulty in breathing the murky air.
First case of actually fatal smog. 20 people died. My mother actually had a miscarriage as a result of this incident. So I think it did plant some seeds.
For his remarkable work, Dr. Robert Costanza was awarded the prestigious Blue Planet Prize. Currently a professor at the Institute of Global Prosperity at University College London, Robert Costanza continues to push the boundaries of how we understand progress and well-being in a rapidly changing world. Please help me in welcoming Robert Costanza to National Champion Radio.
Thank you, Andre. Great to be here.
Thanks. Thank you for joining us. I mean, we're really honored to have you. Your work has been, perhaps the most cited work in the field of ecological economics. It's really a field that you pioneered, that you really ushered into the world. How? I mean, your education got you there, but where did this start? Like from the earliest days, where did this start? This was it in you as a young person? Maybe you can talk about, your background and where you grew up and how that may have planted some seeds that grew into the remarkable career that you've had.
Yeah, well, the town that I grew up in, at least for the first 8 years of my life, probably did plant some seeds. It was actually a quite infamous little town in Pennsylvania called Donora, just south of Pittsburgh. And in 1948, they had a big air pollution incident. First case of actually fatal air pollution or smog in that's been recorded. So it was in this, Monongahela Valley. They had a steel mill. They had a temperature inversion that captured all of the emissions from the steel mill for like a week. And so this really dense smog emerged. You could barely see the hand in front of your face, evidently, at noon. And 20 people died. Many more people had ongoing, respiratory problems. My mother actually had a miscarriage as a result of this incident. So, I would have had an older brother probably if it hadn't been for this incident. But nevertheless, I think it did plant some seeds. And eventually, the steel mill closed down. It led fairly directly, I think, that incident and a few others. The London smog in 1952, which killed 6,000 people, and LA smog, and I think all those incidents led to the Clean Air Act, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. So a lot of the environmental movement really kind of got kicked off in a way by some of these disasters that happened. Do
you remember that growing up? The sort of when did you remember becoming aware of that as a young person?
Yeah, not till I was like 7, 8.
Makes sense. Yeah,
I think before that, it was, and it was something that was happening in the environment. And a lot of people, and I guess I really became aware of it because we moved from that town and to South Florida. A lot of the people that worked in the steel mill, like my father, decided, and after they closed the steel mill down, they moved away. So we moved to to Hollywood, Florida, and that's where I grew up after that.
How do you
And
balance
eventually,
that? I mean,
what do you mean?
like you said,
What do you mean?
the town was impacted by it. Your mother was directly impacted, and your father worked there and was impacted the other way. I mean, that really almost gets right to the core of that trade off. Thinking economically about the environment. I mean, maybe we're jumping too deep. We can come
No,
back to that,
no,
but that seems to be
indeed, that
right on the
that
head
has
of the.
been, yes, hit the nail on the head. Yeah, in fact, this steel mill made wire for nails, but so yeah, I think those sorts of trade-offs are something that we need to take much more seriously these days. We live in a whole new geologic era, the Anthropocene, because of the magnitude of the human impact on our life support system. So those were, and I think a lot of that began in earnest, in that post-war period when we really sort of went what's been called the Great Acceleration in terms of GDP and economic activity and all those kinds of things. And we didn't pay enough attention, I think, to all of the side effects of that activity. It certainly had benefits in various ways. And we're focused maybe too much on those benefits, and we're not considering the negative side effects. And that gets back to the question of, well, how do we measure well-being? What is the goal of the economy? What are we trying to achieve? Is it just growing GDP and having more income and for people, or is it something broader than that? Is it the well-being of the current society, but also the well-being of the rest of nature and the well-being of the future societies? So I think we've got to take that broader picture, and we have to look at the whole system, not just the market economy, also to get at what those side effects are and how to build that better, more inclusive, more comprehensive picture of the kind of world that we're really trying to create. So I think that gets back to the issue of ecological economics. What is it, and how is it different potentially from the conventional view? And I think the conventional view is just a bit too narrowly focused on the market and how it functions and those kinds of the economy as a part of the system, but not looking at the whole system, not looking at how that interacts with society. So how do income inequality effects relate to people's well-being, and also how does it impact with the rest of nature, with the planetary boundaries as they've been called, and the way that ecosystems provide for our sustainable well-being. So I think all of those things are certainly interconnected, and go back in a way to the seeds of that trade-off. Like how do we make sure that we're not impacting our well-being inadvertently by some of the ways that we conceive the economy and the ways that we manage the economy. So,
Yeah, where the value of the respiratory impacts and all the negative externalities of the plant worth the money, the economic, the I mean, like I said, calling it economic solely really is really just about the monetary value
indeed,
and whatever that is, and the purchasing power perhaps, and then the value of the nails, I guess, that they're producing in other people's lives. But what's the downstream impact of that? So the seed perhaps were planted there in Pennsylvania, and did they begin to sprout out in Hollywood, Florida? Did you start to have some impacts, some thoughts about going this route? Were you a young person who was already in line with this, or when did that start to manifest?
I got to spend more time outside, I think, in Florida, where the weather was a little bit warmer. In fact, that's and I think that ended up moving me in the direction of trying to study the environment. So when I finally got to to college, I actually started out in aerospace engineering
Really?
at Purdue in Indiana, because I thought, okay, engineering would be cool. This was during this, the space race and the the moon landings and all of that. So
Okay.
that was sort of headed there. But then when I got there, I decided, no, that's really not it was a little too cut and dried, and I wanted something a little more creative. So I transferred back to the University of Florida and got a degree in architecture, which combined the sort of engineering and also the sort of creative side. And as part of that degree, I actually got connected with a project that was going on that was studying South Florida, the whole Kissimmee Everglades basin, with this professor Howard Odom from was at the University of Florida at the time, and ended up doing my master's degree project was really trying to map how that system had changed over time from 1900, when there was very little urban development, up through, in that case, up to about 1973, using satellite imagery, which had just become available, and some air photos and things like that. But that program that Professor Odom ran was in systems ecology. So it was really looking at the whole system, and that training, I think, was not as common, certainly, as it is now. The whole idea of systems thinking, was fairly new. So I think that took me off in the right direction as well. And looking at the way a whole landscape had changed over that more extended period, you couldn't ignore, the economic influences that determined how that landscape was changing. You couldn't ignore, the natural features of the landscape and how they influence things. So this whole idea of looking at the whole system in a more comprehensive way, I think, sort of started to grow there. And then let's see, after that, my first job after getting the PhD there at the University of Florida was at Louisiana State University, working on coastal wetlands and how they were being affected by oil exploration and things like that, and how they contributed to well-being. So we did some studies on the value of those coastal wetlands, but also on how they were changing and the sort of coastal dynamics, and trying to understand that. And it's where I met with Herman Daly, who was another Blue Planet Prize winner, an earlier one. And he was in the economics department, and one of the pioneers, really, of this idea of steady state economics, of sort of beyond growth, and not thinking of the economy more as an ecosystem rather than as a something more narrow and just the market. So we collaborated on this creation, I think, of the Ecological Economics Society and the Ecological Economics Journal, and a way to think about how do we understand and manage this whole system more comprehensively. And from there, it's been a career of trying to elaborate on some of these ideas. How do we value those natural resources and ecosystems? How do we make it clear, that they do contribute significantly to our sustainable well-being, and also the social aspects as well. So how do we build a social capital, which we know is really important to people in terms of their well-being. So yeah.
Okay, so I mean, taking a step back from there, you were a Boilermaker. You were a Purdue Boilermaker for how long? A year or a semester?
For a year and a half.
Couple years in the aerospace. Yeah. Now, for some of our audience are young people who are, thinking, they're in college or they're thinking about majors and things like this. How do you maybe, talk about that, knowing, or that, I mean, that's a pretty big decision, right? To leave Purdue, to go back to Florida, to go to Florida and transfer. Now, did you transfer specifically for the change in major? And maybe you can help people just maybe think through your thoughts through that process. Obviously, you're in academia. You've seen plenty of people go through their academic journey. Maybe you can just talk about thinking through that decision, and then when did you know that this was the one for you?
I'm still not sure about that. But
yeah.
But I think what I've learned from that experience is that to really solve some of the problems that we're talking about these days, it takes a much more inter or transdisciplinary approach. And the systems approach, I think, is also along those lines. And our educational institutions tend to push people much too much into silos and to particular disciplines, and sort of reinforce production in those disciplines rather than trying to branch out and connect the dots. So we're doing a really good job of studying the dots, but not that great a job of connecting the dots.
Oh, that's
And I
great.
think that's what we need. That's what we need more of. And I think that is changing. But I think we need to emphasize that getting outside of the conventional disciplines and trying to build those bridges. And that's really what ecological economics is all about as well. We define it as a transdisciplinary approach. So we're not saying it's an alternative, like this is the alternative to economics. We're saying, oh yeah, we have to include economics and ecology and psychology and, sociology and any other ology that sort of makes sense to help solve the problem, and define the approach. I don't want to call it a discipline, to get away from that sort of narrowness, but the approach is really about solving the problem. And what is the problem? The problem is creating this sustainable and desirable future. And in order to do that, I think we need to understand how the system functions, in a more comprehensive way. So, ecology and economics both come from the same Greek root, oikos, which means the house. And so literally ecology is the study of the house and economics is the management of the house. So you gotta kind of do both of those things together.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting too. I didn't know they had the same origin.
Yeah.
Do you think that the perhaps the incentives of individuals thinking about career, money, etc., the way that the system is set up tends to put them into career paths that eventually maybe overload in the way that we take care of and think about the environment? Are we setting ourselves up for the best minds to be in professions that aren't really contributing to a more dynamic and systems oriented thought process about the environment and how that should be included in the economy versus just the more, I think you've had this in some of your work when it comes to sort of like individualism and the rugged individualistic future, and those sort of incentives versus a more collective and social future. And something I'm not sure if you've seen that, but it seems that, a lot of people, high performers, are told that these are the ways to go because this is what's going to get you the X, Y, and Z incentive down the road.
Right. No, I think that's certainly a view that's out there, that we have to be individualistic, we have to be competitive, and I think that's kind of the standard economic model of human behavior. But I think the research has shown that that's not really the way people behave, and that's not really what contributes to people's overall sense of well-being. There was a really good book by Tim Kasser, a colleague of mine, called The High Price of Materialism. And he studied, and looked at and showed that people that are more oriented towards, material things, towards income and jobs like that, also have higher levels of both mental and physical illness than people who are more broadly oriented, toward the kind of things that support them. So, and I think there's been a lot of other research in positive psychology, for example, that gets into, what actually does contribute to people's sense of well-being. And, certainly having a secure job, not having to worry about money, that sort of thing is an important component. But, your social interactions, your achievements, there's a whole range of things that are also as important, if not more important, I think, than simply the material, consumption aspects of it. So getting at that broader conception of what actually does contribute to people's well-being, I think, is an important part of it. And then how do we create a society that actually can provide that kind of support? So that's I forgot where we started on this discussion, but
Yeah. No. I mean, I was talking about incentives, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, so taking a step back, getting into a little bit more in the nitty gritty of ecological economics. Maybe you can talk about your favorite example of maybe the misplaced value of nature or how nature is undervalued. I know you talked about hurricanes in an example and how there's, a natural way to go about that versus building dams and levees, et cetera. But yeah, what maybe there's that example or any of your other favorites that really highlight this idea of the extra value that nature's providing to lives and well-being that's being undermined in the system.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of examples, but I'll give you that one about storm protection. So, what's the value of coastal wetlands, for example, for protecting against the damages from hurricanes? So we've done some work on that and published a paper recently where we were able to look at the global value of that storm protection service. The way we did it was by looking at historically all of the storm tracks. They've been, tracking these storms since 1900 or so. So we've got a lot of data on where the storms were. There's also was a good database on the damages that these storms caused. So we know where they were, we know how much damage they caused. And by looking at their tracks, we could now go back and look at GIS data on how many wetlands, what area of wetlands and what type of wetlands were in the swath of each of those storms. And we know how much damage they caused for each storm. We know how big the storms were. So we could put all of that data together into a statistical model and estimate the avoided damages. So if those wetlands were not there, how much more would the damage have been? And then we can map that, around the world. So it varies, depending on the probability of getting hit by a storm, how much infrastructure is there to be protected, how much wetlands there to do protection. So all of that influences the value. But you add it all up, it turned up to be about $450 billion a year in the value of those coastal wetlands just for storm protection. Compare that with, building seawalls, for example, for storm protection. They're expensive. They're going to degrade. They have to be maintained. They don't do anything except storm protection, whereas wetlands provide a whole range of other ecosystem services, in terms of recreation and fisheries and carbon sequestration. So there's a whole long list that we've gone into. So it makes economic sense, to build or to maintain, or build these coastal wetlands rather than the sort of hard infrastructure. And I think that example it also applies in a lot of other cases. This idea of nature-based solutions. So we should utilize our natural ecosystems to provide the services rather than using the hard infrastructure, which is often more expensive and less valuable when you take into account all of the other things that these systems can do.
Yeah, what are some other nature-based solutions? That's fascinating. And yeah, it's like the wetlands are there, the storms come in, these wetlands have protective value and perhaps reducing the speed with which the storm is coming in, or they divert it to some kind of degree. And overall, the impact is that it's less damaging. Each storm that comes through these wetlands, they're less damaging. And so instead of building some wall, how about we just build up our wetlands? Because not only are they going to help with the storm like the wall does, they have other impacts, and people have so many benefits that come from them. So how about we think about more natural solutions to the resources that are already given to us,
Indeed.
And so, I really love that. I think that's really, that's something I don't think people think about too often. Maybe there's some other, I don't know if urban
and if you
farming
think about it as, I think there are those kinds of solutions, in many different situations. Maintaining forests, for example, on hillsides, that prevents landslides. It provides water, treated water, et cetera. I know I lived in Portland, Oregon for a while, and their entire water supply was based on a watershed, that they maintained as an undeveloped watershed because it provided fresh water that they didn't have to treat even. So,
So instead of a water treatment facility, they literally have a
they protect the
natural.
forest. Yes.
The forest provides natural water treatment for fresh water.
Right. Right. And it does all these other things as well at the same time. So you're getting a much better deal, I think, with these nature-based solutions. And I think pointing that out, it requires some effort. You have to do some analysis and say, yeah, well, let's look at it, from the right perspective. And but it is becoming, I think, much more accepted and implemented. So, for example, in Louisiana, where it was before, they had been losing a lot of the coastal wetlands, and still are, because it's a deltaic plain. Those coastal wetlands were built from the sediments coming down the Mississippi River, being distributed out onto the continental shelf, and sort of being captured and aggregated by the coastal marshes that grew there. So they could actually capture these sediments and build more marshes, etc. So that whole deltaic plain has evolved in that way. But more recently, they had flooding in Louisiana, and they decided, oh, we better put levees along the side of the river and not allow it to flood, and therefore all of these sediments that were building the deltaic plain are now going off the edge of the continental shelf, and we're causing a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And at the same time, the oil and gas industry was dredging canals into these wetlands to drill oil wells that were disrupting the hydrology. So they were losing a significant amount of those wetlands over time due to those impacts. That affected, their ability to protect New Orleans and other coastal regions from these hurricanes. And Hurricane Katrina, for example, had much more damage than it would have otherwise had those wetlands still be in place. So now the idea is, well, how can we reestablish some of those wetlands? Can we divert the Mississippi River, at the appropriate times to redistribute those sediments back into the marshes and allow them to rebuild, et cetera. So that whole policy of, instead of levying the river and getting rid of those sediments, let's use them, more effectively in the way that they were originally being used to build the delta.
Wow. And so nature has this way that it was working, and it led to these benefits. And one came in from perhaps a sensible solution. Hey, we're getting flooded, and we don't want to get flooded. So let's build let's divert this water somewhere else, in essence. Yeah. The other side of that, though, was industry coming in and going directly into these marshes, right? And the oil and gas industry coming in and creating negative impacts with their goals and their desires. So maybe we can talk about the status quo and some of the actors on the stage that keep things headed in this direction that isn't healthy for the planet.
Yeah. Well, my most recent book was titled Addicted to Growth. And the idea is that part of the reason, I think we've known about, these problems, these side effects and the negative issues, and, all of the things that we're seeing now, the poly crisis as it's called, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the equality crisis, if you will. We've known about these problems for decades, and we've also known, I think, about the solutions. But why haven't we acted more quickly? Why haven't we acted on climate change and other things? And one way of framing it is that, well, yeah, we're sort of locked into the current system. It's hard for people to change habits. Habits are difficult to break in any case. But there are positive reinforcements that are keeping the system where it is. And so you can think of it as an addiction at the societal level, in the same way you could think of a drug addiction or an addiction to gambling or anything else. So one way of thinking about that then is, well, okay, if we're addicted, how do we get out? How do we stop that? What's the therapy? And so with this colleagues in psychology, Tim Kasser that I mentioned before, and others. We looked at, well, what therapies, are there that seem to work at the individual scale, and could we learn something from that, from studying that? And it turns out that there's a therapy called motivational interviewing that seems to be quite effective at the individual scale, which instead of confronting addicts, with their problem, which tends to get denial, and it's kind of what we're doing at the societal scale by emphasizing so much that we have these problems, we've got to stop doing this. They engage addicts in a discussion of their life goals. What do they want to achieve with their life? Take them out of the present into the future and say, where do you want to be? And if that's where you want to be, then maybe you're not heading in the right direction. So it kind of you need that clear goal, in order to motivate the changes, the difficult changes, and they are difficult in both cases, to overcome that lock-in or addiction. So the obvious analogy at the societal scale is, well, how do we build that shared vision about where we want to be as a society? And I think, things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and that whole process, I think, is a definite step in the right direction there. I think it's probably the first time in human history, really, when all the countries in the world have agreed on this set of goals for what they want to achieve. But I think we need to expand that, process to include, more of the general public and other parts of society, the business community, et cetera. How do we build that shared vision? Because certainly the current, dominant shared vision is economic growth. Let's just continue that. That will help. That will solve all problems. We don't need to worry about the side effects. We'll figure those out later. That kind of vision, I think, is what's driving a lot of our policies. So how do we sort of build this alternative shared vision? One of the ways that we've been exploring for how to do that is, well, we could do public opinion surveys. You could say, here's 4 alternative futures for your country, for the world, for your community. Which one of those alternative futures really do you want? Which one do you prefer? Because, and this is a standard way of dealing with future uncertainty these days, this idea of scenario planning. You come up with a group of scenarios that are plausible, that could happen. You're not saying, this is what will happen. You're saying here are some possibilities for the future. And the choices we make today can determine, whether we achieve any one of those possible futures. And we're never going to get to that positive future unless we can, kind of identify it and talk about it and say, this is where we want to go. So, how to do that therapy, how to build that shared vision. I think that's really the challenge going forward. And
that makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of climate denialism is really just the feeling of being maybe like shamed or forced into, you know what I mean? Like the feeling of you must or else we're going to die, which is obviously inherent in the truth of the matter. Yet people would rather, die than be told what to do, or deny than be forcefully told you must reduce this, or you're evil if you don't do that. And it's like, I don't want to hear that,
Right.
Okay.
You got to stop smoking. Otherwise, you're going to get lung cancer. Right.
People don't want to hear that. Right. They don't want to hear that. No. It's motivating to a degree, but it's, do you want to hike a mountain, or do you want to, can you imagine yourself, being able to run with your grandchildren? Right. Like like you said, the positive visions of what it would mean to stop smoking and to have a longer and healthier life. Can you imagine if you were able to do this and that? Can you pick up your kid in a fire and actually, get them out of there? Do you have that kind of stamina right now? No, you don't. So maybe you want to get in better health, This is why you should go to the gym instead of, well, you're overweight and you're, more likely to die from COVID. It's like, some people, but a lot of people, I don't want to hear that. Yeah. And then and maybe they even say, that's not true. I'll deny that as being true as a way to continue to go to my status quo versus, like you said, these positive visions. Hey, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, the world is going to be in a really, really tremendously terrible and hard to manage, chaotic place, our weather systems, etc., if we continue down this path of warming the planet and adding all the CO2, etc.
Right.
Yet, if you say, hey, what if you think about this vision of the world in the future? What about, more peace? What about, I don't know, we could start having flying planes. I don't know, whatever the vision is that, we talked about solar punk, you and I did offline, and some of those visions and how exciting they can be for people, and just a healthy atmosphere and ecosystem and, et cetera. These visions being a better alternative for trying to get more people aboard the future that we'd all like to have versus,
Indeed.
fighting them at the point of their addiction.
Right. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's the idea. And if you take, the Sustainable Development Goals maybe as a starting point, so I think if you ask people, would you like a world where those goals were achieved, or would you like a world where that seems to be headed in the same direction that we're going? And like I said, we've done some surveys of people in Australia, and I've also seen a more recent survey of different countries around the world, and they asked, which of those two scenarios you want, the kind of business as usual where we seem to be headed, or you want this more sustainable world? And by a large margin, people just find that sustainable world more desirable. There's more equity, peace. We're sort of spreading the wealth more evenly, but we're also protecting the environment. But people still have enough. It's not like they're suffering, and I think that's often the kind of negative side of the vision when you say we want to deal with climate change. Well, doesn't that mean we've got to stop economic growth and everybody's going to be poorer?
Yeah.
In fact, I think it's a sacrifice not to change to this more sustainable vision. It's not a sacrifice. The real sacrifice is to keep going the way we are, because we're not headed in a very positive direction. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's clear, I think, in some of the political discussions going on these days, even in the U.S. Do we want a positive, hopeful vision, or do we want a sort of negative, let's go back to the past kind of vision?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe you can speak on that. I mean, it's heating up. We got Kamala Harris. We have Donald Trump. We're recording here early September, so 8 weeks out, something like this.
Yeah.
And so things are getting. I mean, you're obviously, not obviously. You're coming from London right now as we're speaking. How does it look from there? And I don't know. We're inundated. It's you can't turn on anything that has an ad without seeing something, and it's often quite a negative vision of the other person, et cetera, terror, smear, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk about what it looks like from London and these two opposing visions of the future.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly not inundated with the advertising here, which is a good thing. So people can stand back a little bit. But
they're not spending their advertising dollars on.
But I think the Trump vision, the Project 2025 vision, is a throwback, to a time when there was less less rights for women. The whole story. So, and I think people recognize that and see it, as some it's not a positive vision for the future, really. It's a vision that's where there's more control by a smaller subset of society, and I think the Harris, the Democratic vision is more inclusive. It's trying to say we are all in this together, less divisive, and I think that's a really welcome, difference. And like I was saying, I think that's the kind of thing that can really motivate people. A more positive vision, not the more negative, divisive kind of vision. I think we'll see that I hope we'll see that in in the election results, but it
Yeah.
seems to be headed in that direction. So there she's trying to include Republicans in this, in her vision, say that she's the president, would be the president for all Americans, where I think
Yeah.
the Trump vision is much more narrow, and saying, we really should be about, white men, and that the women should be, trad wives.
Such an archaic perception.
I know, and it always surprises me, how could that be as popular as it is in the U.S. That's one thing I really don't understand.
Yeah.
How could that actually sell?
Yeah.
But
I mean, thinking
anyway.
about those visions, those competing visions, how do you think politics, I guess, plays, massively into that, right? Here's a massive, vote of confidence for a certain vision, right?
Right.
I guess, how does that factor into, I know you guys have done surveys and things like this. Have you looked into, I guess, how political, even if they're local campaigns or for governor or et cetera, and those competing visions of the future, it doesn't seem like people really, on either side, we're getting better visions. I agree, of the future on the one side, but it doesn't seem like anybody's really thinking too far out,
Right.
like giving us, like, how do we become a level 1 civilization as a global species? No one's really talking like that on the
Right.
the Kardashev
Right.
the Kardashev scale.
Right, and the Democrats are still focused on growth, as it's growth as the solution to all problems.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think we do need, a different approach to governance in general. I think it's the systems we have now are, democracies in name only, really.
Yeah.
They're really not including the true demos, the people, and how they feel. So, and there are some alternatives that have been proposed. It's, the expansion of what's called deliberative democracy, where instead of having, elected representatives, you have representatives that are randomly drawn from the population, of qualified individuals. It's the way that the Greeks used to do it.
Ooh.
It's called sortition.
Almost like jury duty.
Yeah, exactly like jury duty. And then you get a more representative sample of the population than you do by, electing representatives, which are subject to funding and, all of the things that can go wrong with electing representatives, including presidents. So, if we did more of that, and it's, in the situations where it's been tried, that sort of citizens' assemblies and deliberative, kind of juries, they come up with solutions that are more acceptable, I think, to the broader population, and more and sort of better group decisions, really, than we tend to come up with the kind of democracy that we have now. So that would be one way that we need to change. And I think, in fact, what democracy should really be about, the essential feature of democracy should be about just this issue of what kind of world do we want? How do we build that shared vision? Because once you've established that, then, which policies will best achieve that vision becomes a bit more obvious. But as long as we don't have the shared vision, we're arguing about policies that are heading in often different directions, and that's what the argument will remain. And if it's always about who can get 51% of the population to go along with something, well, they may go along for one iteration, but then the other 49% will do everything they can to undo that 51% decision, and we just oscillate, back and forth around not making progress at all. So
yeah, we stultify.
Yeah, so it's been said that democracy is a great idea and we ought to try it.
Yeah, yeah. And so your journey took you eventually outside of the United States.
Yeah.
Right, and you started to have a much more global. Obviously, you're coming out of London now. You spent some time in Australia. Maybe you can talk about that part of your journey? What took you there, and what do you think that perspective in that journey has given you as far as your perspective? Obviously, you have a global perspective and thinking about not only our species but the world around us, which obviously, in my opinion, is a part of our species. We're not just gonna go to Mars. We're gonna have to bring an ecosystem out there because that's how we live. We have oxygen and et cetera, et cetera. Like, we're not just a species or individual body in and of itself, right? We have to bring all of that with us in our pods on Mars, for example. And so, yeah, I mean, taking it back to your journey, maybe you can, continue that story of your development and how it then took a more global journey and direction.
Yeah, well, I think that the whole systems perspective is a more global to begin with. So trying to understand how the whole planet, functions, and and so and I've been to many places around the world, and I think that's something that would benefit more people actually, to be able to see how things are done in different places and to not be so parochial and so focused completely on where they are. Um, yeah, but in my case, I moved around in the U.S. I spent a sabbatical year in Stockholm, Sweden, at the Bayer Institute for Ecological Economics. It's one of the first sort of institutional structures set up for that around that theme.
Okay.
And Swedish society, particularly at the time, I think was very communitarian, had much better kind of democratic discussion going on. They weren't so influenced by money and politics. They had better, public discussion and more equity as well. And I think their overall sense of societal well-being was better because of that. So being able to experience, how different societies actually felt when you were living in them, I think was an important part of my education, shall we say. And Australia is a very interesting country as well, where to become a citizen, you had to take a citizenship test, and one of the questions on the test was, what do you mean by mateship? So this whole idea of mateship, that everyone should be considered a mate. We're all in this together. It's kind of part of their culture there. So in a sense,
Hey, mate.
they try to, yeah, exactly. So, and everyone, has a fair chance, and so this sort of equality of opportunity, at least, I think, is something that they take seriously, maybe more seriously than we do. But I've also lived in different states in the U.S., and there's quite a difference, of course,
Yeah.
between South Florida and I lived in Maryland and Vermont in particular. I thought was quite more, the sort of Scandinavian European kind of approach or culture that was there. So anyway, we're
No. You were aware, like, yeah. Maybe you could talk about those different places in the United States,
yeah.
and how they vary communally, culturally. That's really interesting to think about these different cultures. I know you spent some time and working with indigenous cultures as well, and thinking about the way that they look at, the world and the world around in order to build a plan for the future. So maybe you can talk about the indigenous cultures and then also about the different places in the United States and how they vary.
Right. Well, let me start with the second one, because I lived in Vermont for a while, and there I lived in a co-housing community, which was an interesting situation where this is an intentional community where people got together and said, we want to build a community where, we do interact with each other, that the neighbors actually are see themselves as part of a community. So we had like 17 households arranged around a green. We had a common house. Everybody had their own property, so it wasn't that different from any other neighborhood.
Okay.
But the difference was that they had sort of regular meetings. They tried to make decisions as a community. They had community events that were a little more frequent, shall we say. And, it was just an intention to build the social capital. This happens in regular communities as well. I mean, communities do build social capital like that. This was just a more intentional version of doing that. And I thought it was great. Yeah. And, my two
How many
kids
people were involved with that?
So there were 17 households. I guess there were about 50
Wow.
people or so at that particular one. Yeah.
And I'm sure you guys built a really deep connection, right? Like that was something
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. No, I think it's become quite a movement around the world. It's actually started, I guess, in Denmark. This idea that you could build these, intentional communities. We actually did a research project while I was at Vermont that tried to compare the quality of life in these intentional communities and various places with the sort of unintentional, with regular neighborhoods, and you find that people are, at least they report that they're happier in these intentional communities because they have more of the social capital. It's not just the built infrastructure, of the house that they're living in. It's the community and how they interact with other people. That's obviously very important to people's well-being. So the challenge is how do you create that kind of social capital, and also the natural capital, the environment that they were built in. So a lot of them were thought of themselves as eco villages, where they tried to be cognizant and interact with the natural environment, to the extent that they could. So that kind of model I think could be expanded on in the kinds of communities that we build to pay more attention to the social interaction and the interaction with the natural environment. The other thing we were talking about was indigenous communities, and one of the things that we've been pursuing is, how do we manage our environment in a way that's more consistent with, I guess, the way that indigenous communities have evolved to manage their environment in a more sustainable way. And this builds on the work of Elinor Ostrom, who was a colleague and a Nobel Prize winner in economics that developed with her research on how indigenous communities around the world managed watersheds, managed fisheries. How did they build these institutional structure to sustainably manage the commons, essentially, common access resources. And so, and she came up with these design principles for institutions to manage the commons. You can't leave them as open access. So you have to have property rights, on these resources, but they can be more community-based property rights, that say who can use the resources in what way. And also that the institutions need to be developed and implemented and maintained in a more collaborative way, with all of the stakeholders involved. So we've been developing this idea of common asset trusts as a way to manage natural resources in general. And also some of the major global commons that we still have, like the atmosphere and the oceans. Mm-hmm. So, particularly for the atmosphere, if we thought of the atmosphere as a common asset that we all own together, then you can say, well, let's start charging those who damage our asset, for the damages, and use that money, put that into a trust, and we use it to undo the damages to the extent possible to make the atmosphere whole. So, turns out that there's 90 entities in the world that are responsible for about 2/3 of the carbon emissions. So let's go for them, big oil companies, essentially, a few others. So we could go, and start charging them for damages, just like we charged, Exxon for damages from oil spills. We could charge fossil fuel sector, essentially, for damages to for spills of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then use those funds to sort of undo those damages, but also to achieve other social goals. So this idea of an atmospheric trust, I think, is something that sort of follows from that idea of how indigenous communities have dealt with and managed their their natural resources through the lens of Elinor Ostrom's kind of generalizations of that process, and then apply that at the global scale. Same idea for the oceans. We could have an ocean trust that behaved in a similar manner, but also at smaller scales. If you're trying to manage a watershed that has a mix of private ownership of some parts of it and public ownership with national parks or other sorts of features, how do you manage that whole thing in a way that maximizes the value of the asset and not just extracting resources? You say we want to keep that asset functioning as healthy as we possibly can. So if you thought of it as being held in trust, for all of the stakeholders, but then managed in a way that would maximize that value, then you could build up some different set of policies. That's a different vision, if you will, for what that system could look like. That could motivate the kinds of behavior and policies that would really help to achieve those goals. So otherwise, you get different stakeholders, are in conflict essentially, trying to battle each other out. Adjacent farmers are in conflict with each other rather than cooperating and saying, well, we could all actually do better if we work together.
Maybe you can explain that from the perspective of, say I'm John. I'm outside of Detroit right now. So let's say I'm John from Detroit, and you're saying that I'm going to be a co-owner in the atmosphere around me. And these individuals are, we're going to put that all into a trust. And if these individuals impact my property, which is our property, then they're the ones who have to pay for that. I think like the idea of giving individuals the feeling of the ownership of these properties could go a long way in them wanting to defend it, obviously, right? I mean, mine is probably one of the earliest things kids learn to say, right? This possessiveness and people get very defensive of the things they perceive as theirs, right? Yeah. And even if the world may perceive them as someone else's, they say this is mine, and they go and try to take it, Yeah. And so, maybe you can explain that from like how an ordinary citizen might feel that sense of community and ownership at once, so that they can say, no, you're not allowed to do that to wait, that's mine. And maybe there's a way to articulate that value to them, or maybe even give that value to them. I don't know if there's a trust dividend for the, besides just good health, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of cases where they do actually provide dividends from these kinds of systems.
Like
so there's
truly.
the Alaska Permanent Fund, as it's called.
Okay.
Takes some of the revenues from oil and gas exploration, puts them into a fund, and they give a check every year to every citizen of Alaska. And Republican governors have tried to get rid of that system,
of course,
consistently, but they can't, because people are saying no. I'm getting a check every year from.
So people get a check every year. Why?
From as their share, essentially, of the oil and gas exploration that goes on in Alaska. It's called the Alaska Permanent Fund. In Norway, they have the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, which is a fraction of the oil and gas revenue from their North Sea operation, and that funds a lot of the public services that occur in Norway. They put it all into. So imagine if they did more of that kind of thing with oil and gas revenues in other countries, like Nigeria, for example, instead of going into the pockets, of a few, CEOs or executives or the government. If it actually went into a fund that supported the population. So that's taking that same idea and saying, well, we all own the atmosphere. So it's not that you own it to get privately, but you own it to collectively, with everyone else on the planet. But it's still, and like I said, from the basic principles of managing the commons that Ostrom came up for, that's an important first step. You have to have clearly defined boundaries. You have to have it can't be a sort of open access, which these resources currently are. There's no reason we can't do that. and getting people to understand that, I think, that they are collectively, owners of this resource, something that benefits everyone. It's also, partly owned by everyone. I think that would make a big difference in how they dealt and how they felt about climate change. So climate change is not something, some hoax that's happening out there. It's like, hey, you're damaging this thing that really, is important to me and that benefits all of us, the climate and the atmosphere. So engaging people that way. And like I said, you could take some of that trust and give it as a dividend back to the population. That's been thought of as one possibility as well.
Yeah, I think that would
Really,
I
to
think that would
engage
be a
people.
winning solution.
And you could do that, not equally to every person, but based on income, for example. So you could use that to help achieve, SDG 1 or 2, I forget which one it is, but to eliminate poverty. Well, that would be one way to do it.
Yeah, SDG 1 or 2. What was that?
The Sustainable Development Goals.
SDG.
Number
Got
one.
it.
Number one is to reduce, eliminate poverty. Number 2, I forget which way it goes. 1 or 2 is and the others to eliminate hunger.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I think giving John and Metro Detroit a check for the natural resources that are providing value, or like you said, the exploration of the oil and gas, etc. Somehow making a dividend out of these trusted people is only going to strengthen their conviction and rearrange their logic, because it's typically, it's often just latent, and logic is like put on top of the emotion, right? And so if they have that emotional connection to the money or to the dividend, then the logic of, wait, you can't do that because this is a moral reason, I think will come secondarily to people, right? And that's how often incentives work, I think, for people. And so, that's dividend, really interesting.
That dividend doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of a personal check, because if they get a personal check back, okay, they might spend that on, consumer items that just add to the carbon emissions. But if it went back in the way of a dividend, that was something to help, improve the atmosphere. Maybe they get a wind farm, or part of a wind farm, and that makes their electricity, cheaper. So some contribution that's a little more attached to benefiting the atmosphere as well as the individual.
Yeah. Maybe it's a direct.
Might be a better way to do it.
Maybe it's a direct check specifically for their bill or something like that, where it's like it makes it clear to them that they're getting that reduction,
Yeah.
Even that idea of reduced bills in the future has some degrees of separation from, I think, the immediacy. But no, it's all very interesting, and you have such a wonderful frameworks of how these different things can be implemented, and this collective vision. What's the biggest challenge in your work right now that you're facing, and how are you trying to tackle it?
Well, I think this question of how to build this shared vision, I think is probably the most important part of the therapy that is needed. And and I've been thinking, well, what we really need is to be able to engage enough people, in thinking about alternative futures, to really make it get a critical mass there. So how would you do that? Well, one way would be, how do we get some engaging videos, for example, or whole movies. If you think about what movies have been done about the near-term future, they all end up being dystopic. The world is falling apart, or post-apocalyptic. But so could we create some movies, some videos that are, that show people what this alternative future, this sort of sustainability world could look like? I think that would go a long way. So we've been talking with some filmmakers about maybe producing those kinds of short videos, that would say, well, here's 4 alternative futures or 3 alternative futures. What would life be like in those futures, in a way that's engaging enough for people to see themselves as like, oh yeah, I can see myself living in that kind of world. I want that kind of world. I want, I don't want the kind of world that we're in now. I want that kind of world. So how do you really produce those engaging kinds of experiences, and then use, once you've engaged them in that, we could have a discussion about, okay, well, what are your preferences? What do you like or dislike about different aspects of it? Can we begin to build that shared vision through a massive, citizens assembly, shall we say?
Yeah. Okay. So that's been the biggest challenge. Has it been really articulating that vision or delivering it?
Well, I think the first step is articulating it in a way that is engaging enough to get enough people to start thinking about. We do have an alternative. We do have an alternative, or there are alternatives. We don't have to continue down the same path with maybe just, minor tweaks in each election cycle. We need to think about as a community, as a global community, we need to think about the kind of world we want to create. If we want something different, because I think if we don't do that, we're going to continue heading down, the wrong path.
Yeah. Let's take a moment to talk about the Blue Planet Prize. Since established by the Asahi Glass Foundation in 1992, the Blue Planet Prize serves to advance progress towards making the Earth more sustainable. The prize is awarded to 2 individuals and organizations annually. Prize winners are announced in June, and the award ceremony, which features commemorative lectures by the recipients, is held in autumn. The Blue Planet Prize has started to make its way as one of the most significant environmental prizes in the entire world. It originates from Japan. Other Blue Planet Prize winners. Can you talk about its stature in the environmental community and what it meant to you personally to be among these distinguished winners?
Yeah. No, it's an amazing honor to be awarded this prize and to be in the company of many of the other winners, some of whom I know and have worked with. For example, Herman Daly was a previous winner, and I talked about our relationship and our co-founding of the Society for Ecological Economics and the journal, etc. But I know several of the others. Matthias Wackernagel and Bill Rees, who started the ecological footprint idea, are also previous winners. Who else do I know? I'd have to look at the list, but I think I know.
Oh, that's great. That was all off memory, huh? That's great.
One major benefit. Hang on a second. I'm gonna not take that one.
Is that an actual phone or is that a cell phone ringtone?
That was a cell phone. Well, that was a cell phone ring. Yeah.
I was gonna say that sounds like a classical phone that I haven't heard since like the 2000s.
So anyway, what was I saying?
You're saying about the impact of the Blue Planet Prize, what you might be able to give you now, and what it meant for you.
I think one major impact is that it just draws attention to the kind of work that I've been doing, and the co-winners this year was the IP BEST, the International Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is sort of have been working along the same lines, about biodiversity, ecosystem services, how valuable they are to the planet. So, and that group is like the IPCC, but applied to ecosystem services. So, yeah, I think it has become. I don't think it's as well known for sure as the Nobel Prizes, but I think it is.
Sure.
In the environmental community, at least. As that same level of status. I think that was their intention with setting up the prize, was that there wasn't any Nobel Prize for the environment, so they set this up, to sort of fill that gap. So anyway, yeah, it's a great honor, and hopefully it will help move the needle on some of these issues that we've been talking about. There is.
Have you?
Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, there is a pretty substantial monetary award that goes along with it. So
Okay.
hopefully I can use that to sort of further some of the ideas that I've had.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. You know, you've gotten a pretty substantial monetary award from the Blue Planet Prize, and you plan to leverage it for some of these initiatives. I mean, are you thinking
Yeah.
about making films? Are you thinking about, you
Possibly.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that's amazing. I mean, it's really important that you know, like these. It's once again, I mean, it goes all the way back to that original story about the nails and the externalities of the nails, you know, and the production of that factory in that town that you grew up in. And it's that these mega structures that these let's call them capitalist structures that are able to extract freely from these communities and create these externalities typically have so many resources in order to further their endeavors once they do the extraction, such that the
Yeah.
people around them can't really put up an adequate defense and can't
Right.
really enact their visions of what they'd like to do. And so I think prizes like this that can, you know, put some financial backing behind it, and then give individuals like yourself who are just remarkable and the work that they've done, the effort, the excellence that you've produced. And I mean, we haven't talked about it, but I mean, the models that you've created, the amount of analysis and rigor that go into the models that you've created are phenomenal. They're world class. I mean, the different variables that you're thinking about when you're thinking about even just what we talked about with hurricane damage and getting the different data from the satellites and historical data, et cetera, putting it together and doing statistical analysis, making sure in this systems approach that you have, which is so comprehensive, you're thinking about things from so many different angles, and now you're trying to put a value on things outside of just GDP when it comes to human life,
Mhm.
and you've done that without being casual or without being biased. You've
Mhm.
truly just tried to find those the amount of the value of that, and you've put a predictive value, an actual, you know, maybe price isn't the right word, but you know,
No,
on
price is
these
not the right word.
yeah, price isn't the right word, on these ecological assets that we all
Yeah.
have. And so it's almost taking that
Yeah.
rigorous statistical research model of the Western world and adding it to that more, perhaps one of the, you know, indigenous or these different cultures that do value these things. It's saying, well, since you guys don't speak that language, let me put an actual value on it that you can understand. And you know that the scrutiny that's going to come with that requires you to have immense excellence. And so, I mean, thank you for that work. And but
You
yeah,
get,
it's mhm.
don't make it sound like I did this all by myself, though. So
Of course, of
I think
course. I mean,
there's
yeah,
this science these days in particular is a group activity, and so all of these things have had colleagues and collaborators and you know we're part of been part of teams. So yeah,
when you think
but
about excellence in your work and the collaborative work, does a project come to mind to you as one that is perhaps most excellent, the most, I don't know, rigorous, the most competent, or even just one of them? And maybe you can explain it to the audience,
mhm.
how you've come to these conclusions and how, why they've been so regarded to the people who understand what you're up to.
Yeah. Well, maybe let me push back a little bit about the whole rigorous idea because
Yeah, yeah.
I think you know the perfect is the enemy of the good. So I think I think in all of this, and the other quote that I like to use all the time is that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And so you George Box when said that a long time ago. But I think it's really something that we need to keep in mind that there's we don't really have access to the ultimate truth. We can build approximations of what we think is going on in the world. Then we can try to test those and see if they work and are they really useful? Do they help us achieve our goals? And so I think that's really what we need to, the way we need to frame these issues. How do we do a better job? What's a better model?
Yeah.
Not necessarily the model or the most rigorous or the most accurate, because I think we'll never get there.
Sure.
But we can build models that are more useful and that help us achieve our goals. And I think that's part of the problem with the conventional economic model. Is it may have worked okay, in a certain period, with under certain constraints and circumstances, but we're not there anymore. We need to have a different model that's more comprehensive, that's more dynamic, that's more, that sort of fits the circumstances that we're in now. To move forward, and then not get married to that model either. To remember that
Yeah. Yeah.
in fact it's still just an approximation, and we will always be evolving and changing and learning new things. And I think that's the attitude I think that we need to bring to science, and that is the attitude of science, or at least it should be.
Yeah.
This is our best guess at the moment, but we're open to things changing as we learn more, and that we need to adapt. And so I think a better approach is something called adaptive management, where you make a prediction about the future, but then you monitor the results. And this has been applied to policy making as well, that our policy making should be considered experiments that we're performing on the system, not the answer. And we should monitor the results, and if the results are not like we expected, we should adapt and change things, rather than trying to defend our policies and hide the inconsistencies that might come up. So, it's taking a different attitude towards policymaking that's more humble, that's more adaptive, that's more recognizing the fact that we will never know everything that we need to know, and we have to bear that in mind.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, with that, maybe you can talk about your most I don't know, not rigorous, but useful. Maybe
Useful.
one of your most useful or favorite or interesting, the process of getting the information and trying to understand. Right? It's a process of trying to understand better.
So
and I know,
probably, sorry. Well, I think the one that the Blue Planet Prize, the Asahi Foundation, picked up on was the 1997 paper that we published in Nature about the value of the world's ecosystem services, which has a really interesting history that fits this model that I'm talking about. Because that was, I was fortunate to be a Pew Scholar back in the late 90s. And that scholarship brought together people, from different disciplines. And we had a workshop at one point, and put together the idea behind the workshop was to put together an edited book that was edited by Gretchen Daly on this topic of ecosystem services. It came out as a book called Nature Services. But during that workshop, we were sitting around, and there were different people, contributing different chapters on different ecosystem services and blah blah blah. And my thought was, well, why don't we put all of this together and try to come up with a total? What's really can we somehow show how big or how important all of these services are relative to other things? And at the time, NSF was just starting this synthesis center, as it was called, in Santa Barbara, California.
This is the National Science Foundation?
The National Science Foundation, sorry.
No,
the National Science Foundation started the Synthesis Center, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or NCES, in Santa Barbara. And the idea was they would bring together small groups of people to synthesize, information, not create new data, but to say, let's take stuff that's already known or already out there, but put it together in unique ways that are interesting. So we said, this would be an interesting project to do there. We'll synthesize all this information, and we'll come up with a total value for the world's ecosystem services. So we had this workshop in Santa Barbara, and brought together, I think it was about 13, different people. At the time, we didn't really have the internet capabilities that we have now. This was in 1996, I think. So we ended up with like a box of reprints of all of the studies that we could find on different ecosystem services and different biomes, and we spent the better part of a week, trying to formulate how we're going to arrange that and how we're going to synthesize it. And, we sort of ended up with a draft of that paper by the end of the week. And then, follow on, we sort of finished it off and sent it in to a couple journals. Actually, the first journal we sent it to was Science, and they rejected it.
Wow.
They got a bad review, that said, we can't do this. But the editor at Science had a little note, said, yeah, well, I'm rejecting the paper, but I know it's going to get published sometime. So when it does, let me know and we'll write a news piece about it. So then I sent it to Nature, and it did get accepted at Nature, and the Science editor did eventually write a little news blurb about the paper that was published in Nature that they rejected. So that was kind of interesting. Anyway, but I think the great thing about that paper was we acknowledged that this was just an estimate based on information we had at the time. In the largest section in the paper was really the section on limitations and caveats and why it's just an underestimate, really. But at the same time, it was an underestimate, but it was bigger than global GDP at the time. So I think we made the point pretty clearly that these were not small potatoes. This was not a little externality. That I think the economics community sort of thought of the environment in that way. This was a major, or in fact, the major contributor, I think, to human well-being. And here's one way of expressing how major it was. Not the only way, maybe not even the best way, but certainly a way that I think communicated with a lot of people, and they sort of started that process of thinking about this, doing more research on ecosystem services, trying to build that and eventually I think it led to the IPBES, being created. So my co-winner could maybe trace its origins back to that paper and that book. I think together they came out the same year.
Wow. Yeah. And so that's, thanks for sharing that. That's a pretty wild journey
story.
Yeah, definitely interesting story to that conclusion and to that paper. What else do you? Okay.
No, go ahead.
What else do you think? Say we have 1 million people listening to this. What else do you think people ought to know about? What else would you like to talk about and put forward that we haven't talked about so far?
Wow, that we haven't talked about so far.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad we've hit some of the big marks that you want to talk about and discuss.
I think we hit most of the things that I think the only thing to emphasize is that we do have a real opportunity, I think, at the moment to change direction, toward a more positive future. And I think we can't let that opportunity slide by because, historically civilizations have collapsed. It's, if anything, that's kind of the routine output or outcome from historical civilization.
Yeah.
So and now, we're not just a regional civilization. We're not just the Roman Empire. We're not just the Maya. We're a global civilization, and it certainly is possible that whole civilization could collapse because of the problems that we're facing. So, but we don't have to, and I think in order not to, we need to be really creative and create this vision of the kind of world that we want in order to get there. So I think that's the message that yes, it's an opportunity as well as a potential problem, but I think we do have the capability to create a better future, and it's not going to be just from technology. I think it's going to be creating the vision of the kind of world that we want, and using that to generate the kind of technology that we need to get there, not just following technology wherever it leads. So
Yeah. Yeah. What do you mean by that? I mean, like, there's AI that's hot and everybody's riding the wave. Is that like, thinking about firstly, having the end in mind and then thinking about the technologies that we can build along the way? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
well, yeah, like how, if we're going to use AI, it should be towards the purposes that we're talking about, towards building a more equitable, more sustainable world. So, technology is a good servant, but a poor master. We don't want to just let it run our lives and say we'll just go wherever technology leads. It should be our servant, not our not our master. So how do we do that? I think it's certainly possible with any technology, including AI. And I'm not as worried maybe about AI taking over as some people might be, because I don't think the kind of AI that is currently, the large language models that they're currently pursuing are really ever going to get to, like that's called, alternative general intelligence.
Yeah.
To be able to actually think. All they're doing now is sort of, surveying this huge database that's currently available out there through the internet, and saying, well, what word would come next if I were doing this? It goes back to a paper I read many years ago, where they said, well, the thing about if you put enough monkeys in front of enough typewriters, they'd eventually type out all the works of Shakespeare. So they said, well, let's try that. And they started very small and said, well, yeah, of course, if you just gave them regular typewriters and they started typing at random, you'd get garbage. But you just have to give them a little bit of information. If you tell them, what's the letter frequency in the language that you're talking about, and let them then type on typewriters that had that frequency distribution, then you get text that starts to look like, text, like language.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you give them the letter pair distribution, then it starts to actually get some words coming out, mainly 4-letter words. And if you give them the letter triplet distribution, then you start getting, whole sentences that kind of make sense. And that's all that these large language models have done, is just take that to the extreme, where you say, let's give them everything we know about all the text that's already out there, and say, now produce the next most likely thing in response to this input. And so you're not getting anything really creative. You're getting a summary, of just that kind of distribution of data in the world, which can be very useful. So it's good to know what's sort of out there. But I think we need to harness that information harness that capabilities for the common good. And there's also the cost benefit kind of relationship, because to do that kind of model requires a huge amount of energy and information storage and all of those servers all over the world. And is that really the best use of those resources? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a lot of energy, a lot of electricity, a lot of storage capacity.
In order to produce an answer to your prompt about like some random thing that you want.
Yeah, should my hair gel? Should I,
right.
How do I walk my dog when it doesn't want to walk? I mean, if you had, I don't know, millions of dollars, where would you aim them to solve the problems that you see? Are there certain systems, ecological systems, that you would try to beef up and support more, and build out more? Is it more about the messaging and the wording? I'm sure it's a mix of all of those, but I guess in giving some optimistic visions of the things we could be doing, the things that are possible, that are exciting, that maybe are even the low cost ideas. Maybe that's the way to frame it. Hey, what are the most, low cost, quote unquote low, even if it's millions of dollars, that we could do to make the biggest improvement? What gives us the biggest ROI? Not towards our GDP, but towards this other metric.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll push back on what's the biggest thing you can do? Because I think in
Mhm.
general, to make these kinds of system changes require that you do multiple things simultaneously rather
Okay.
than just one thing. And this idea that we can just there's a silver bullet, we could change everything, but that's in systems thinking. You can never just do one thing, because you do one thing, it's going to affect everything else in the system. So you
Ah.
gotta you gotta do generally a range of things, but there is, in a sense, some sort of hierarchy of what makes the most difference in these kinds of systems, and certainly changing the goal of the system is at the top of that list. If you can do that, then that's going to affect a whole range of other things. If you just change one technology in the system, it's unlikely that that's going to change enough to have the kind of impact you're talking about. But so I don't know if that answers the question effectively,
No, no,
but
no. Yeah, it's kind of reorients it, but I mean, given that caveat to it, where are the few places
so
or the things that you start to
where are
address?
the leverage points? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think they're all important. Those different levels
Yeah.
of leverage points, but the most effective one is going to be at the top level of changing the goals, changing the whole paradigm, of what we're trying to achieve with our economies. And I think
Mm.
that's what we've been trying to do with ecological economics and some of this envisioning work and all of that. Is how do we change our fundamental paradigm away from just more and more to let's make it better.
Yeah. Yeah. And so getting people from consumption and money and monetary goals really into a more comprehensive view of what it means to be a healthy and prosperous society. What does it
Yeah.
mean to prosper, to flourish,
Yes. Flourish is
versus,
a flourish is a good word. Prosper is not
yeah,
a bad word either, but you have to take a broader view of what that term means.
yeah,
Not just the economic side of things, but to be truly prosperous, I think you have to take a much more comprehensive approach. So, like we've been talking about,
yeah,
yeah, I
no,
think
for
that's
sure. Yeah, it's definitely
and what
something
and what to
we, I'm
call it,
sorry.
what to call
Mm.
it, and what terminology is going to sort of resonate and the most with people. I think is also a challenge. You so what do we call this new paradigm? Is it the well-being economy? Is it the ecological economy? Is it the donut economy? Is it the regenerative economy? There's like a whole bunch of terms that I think are fairly synonymous and at least overlap quite a bit in what they mean. But do we need maybe we need to come to some consensus there too on just what to call our new paradigm, our new goals. And I think that will happen eventually. Uh,
Yeah,
I like the Swedish term lagom, which I don't know if you've ever heard that term.
I'm not.
Actually, it's well, Swedish term, you probably haven't, but it means everything is just enough. It's like it's not too much, not too little. It's kind of like the Goldilocks
Hmm.
approach, but it's a very popular term in Swedish culture. That you're not trying to achieve the most income you can get. But you don't want to be you don't want to have too little either. So the
Right.
goal really is that everybody has enough,
Yes.
sufficiency rather than maximizing everything, and that leads to a broader sense of societal well-being, I think, and individual well-being as well. If you're constantly trying to outcompete the Joneses, you can be a little more chill and enjoy the aquavit.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that's a good concept to have instilled into a society. And it's interesting. Yeah, it's I guess it's a tough thing to analyze. I'm trying to think about your perspective outside of the United States where you're at now, but obviously being a United States citizen, are we does it look like we're on the verge of collapse from your perspective? Have we lost our sense of the right values and excellence in the right places Yeah, what do you make of the United States in the 21st century?
Well, I think a lot depends on this upcoming election, actually,
Yeah,
and in terms of what direction it goes in, because I think it very easily could, be headed towards collapse. But on the other hand, it doesn't have to go that way. And so the
yeah,
ability to, instill the positive vision into people to get them to work in that direction, I think is what's going to be critical. So I think my dog needs to go for a walk.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming aboard National Champion Radio. We got to get the dog going. You can show the dog. Why don't you show the dog? Can we see?
Come here, Dax. Come here. Come on. Come on. Up here. Come here. Come on. Here, wait. There she is.
Hey, somebody has to go out. Robert, thanks again. I'll definitely, thanks again for joining us on National Champion Radio, for all the work you've done in your career. Congratulations again on the Blue Planet Prize. And we look to talk soon, and we'll share all your stuff with the listeners, and they can figure out where to find you and follow your work. It's amazing work that you're doing, and let's get that vision going of a positive future.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Andre.